Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine when you're alone at home? Then today, we're going to explore 7 chilling horror stories, all based on real accounts, which show how silence can be scarier than we imagine. Get ready for moments of tension and mystery. And before we start, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any scary content like this. Let's go. 1. The familiar voice. It was a cold, cloudy afternoon in Manchester, England. Winter had already set in, and the grey sky seemed to weigh down on the city like a suffocating blanket. Liam, 16, was alone at home. His parents worked late, as they did almost every day of the week, and he used the time to play video games in his room. The red brick house, located on a quiet street in the suburbs, was plunged into silence, except for the sound of digital explosions and electronic screams echoing off the screen. Liam was so immersed in the game that he almost didn't notice when something strange happened. In the middle of an intense match, he heard a soft voice calling out, "Little Liam!" He froze for a moment. It was the nickname his mother had used when he was little, but it had been years since she had called him that. He took off his headphones and looked around the room. Everything was quiet. "I must be imagining things," he muttered to himself. He went back to the game, but his concentration was gone. The voice seemed to have infiltrated his mind, disturbing him in a way he couldn't explain. A few minutes later, he heard it again. "Little Liam, come here." This time it was clearer and came from somewhere outside the room. His heart began to beat faster. He knew he was home alone. His parents were at work and wouldn't be back until late at night. Trying to stay calm, he called out, "Mom, is that you?" No answer came. He slowly got up from his chair and opened the bedroom door. The corridor was dark. The dim lights made every corner seem to hide something invisible. "Mom!" he called again, this time with more hesitation in his voice. Still no answer. Liam descended the stairs with cautious steps, each creak of the wooden floor amplifying his anxiety. The living room was empty, so was the kitchen. He checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. They were. Even so, the chill at the back of his neck wouldn't go away. As he walked around the house trying to find a rational explanation for what he had heard, the voice came again. "Little Liam." This time, it was an almost imperceptible whisper, but it seemed to be coming from directly behind him. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. Liam began to convince himself that he was going mad. Maybe it was the stress of school or the accumulated tiredness. He tried to go back to his room and ignore what had happened, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. When he finally sat down in front of his computer again, he noticed something strange. The door to his parents' bedroom, which he was sure he had left open, was now closed. He stood still for a moment, staring at that door as if it could move on its own. "Little Liam," called the voice again, now louder and clearer than ever. He felt a shiver run down his spine. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Something or someone was toying with him. Gathering up all the courage he could find within himself, he walked to his parents' bedroom and slowly turned the doorknob. The room was empty, but something caught his eye immediately. On the bed was an old photo of him with his mother, taken when he was about 5 years old. It was a photo he hadn't seen for years, and it certainly shouldn't have been there. Before he could process what was happening, he heard footsteps behind him in the hallway. Light, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking straight towards him. "Little Liam," said the voice again, now so close that it seemed to be right next to his ear. He turned quickly to face whoever it was, but there was no one there. Liam ran to his room and locked the door behind him with trembling hands. He grabbed his cell phone and called his mother immediately. "Hi, darling, is everything all right?" she replied in her usual calm tone. "Mom, were you here today?" he asked desperately. "Of course not. "I've been at work since early morning," she replied with a touch of concern in her voice. "Why?" He hesitated for a moment before replying, "Nothing. I just thought I heard you." His mother laughed softly into the phone. "You must be tired or something." But Liam knew it wasn't tiredness or imagination. Something was wrong in that house. He spent the rest of the afternoon locked in his room, listening carefully for any sound coming from the hallway or other parts of the house. Sometimes he thought he heard distant whispers or light footsteps downstairs, but he didn't have the courage to go out and check. When his parents finally arrived home that evening, Liam told his mother and father everything. They exchanged worried glances before his mother finally spoke. "Liam, there's something we've never told you." She explained that years before he was born, she had lost a baby daughter, a girl called Lily, in the same room where Liam now slept. Since then, she had occasionally heard voices or felt presences in the house, but she never wanted to frighten him by telling these stories. "Maybe Lily is trying to communicate," she suggested, with a melancholy tone. But Liam was sure of one thing: that voice wasn't his lost sister's or anything benevolent. There was something darker in that presence, something that used his mother's familiar voice to draw him in. Over the next few days, the strange events continued. Objects moved around without explanation, doors closed on their own, lights flickered for no apparent reason. And there was always that voice calling little Liam, ever more insistent and closer. One night, while trying to sleep, Liam woke abruptly to the sensation of someone pulling at his blanket. He quickly turned on the lamp and saw faint marks in the dust on the floor, marks like footprints too small to be adult. It was then that he realized whatever was in that house didn't just want to scare him. It wanted something deeper, perhaps his own sanity or even his soul. Even after moving out of that house years later, Liam never forgot the persistent whispers of that familiar voice calling out to him in the dark. Little Liam. 2. The Night Visitor. It was a freezing dawn in Reykjavik, Iceland. The wind was blowing hard, carrying snowflakes that were piling up on the sidewalks and covering the deserted streets. Inside a small wooden house, lit only by the dim light of a lamp in the hallway, Emma was sleeping soundly. Ever since she had moved to that isolated neighborhood, the absolute silence of the nights was something that comforted her. But that night, something woke her up. She opened her eyes slowly, confused. A distinct sound echoed through the house, ringing, 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 knocks on the front door. For a moment she lay motionless in bed, trying to figure out if she was dreaming or if the sound was real. Then she heard it again, tock, tock, tock. It was steady and rhythmic, as if someone was waiting patiently for an answer. The clock next to the bed read 3:17 in the morning. Who could be knocking on the door at that hour? Her heart began to race as she got up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The house was cold, and the wooden floor creaked slightly under her feet as she walked to the hallway. Emma hesitated before reaching the living room window, which overlooked the entrance to the house. She pushed the curtain aside a little with her fingertips and peeked out. In the dim light from the balcony, a man was standing. He didn't seem to be dressed for the intense cold of that early morning. He wore only a thin jacket and dark pants. His head was tilted slightly downwards, his face partially covered by the shadow of the hood he was wearing. He was motionless, except for the hands that knocked softly on the door. Tock, tock, tock. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. Something about that man seemed wrong. He didn't look lost or asking for help. There was something deliberate about his posture, as if he knew exactly where he was and who was inside the house. She slowly backed away from the window, trying to control her panting. She picked up her cell phone from the table next to the sofa and quickly typed in the number of the local police. Before pressing call, she hesitated. What if it was just someone needing help? Maybe a neighbor with car trouble or someone lost in the snow. But why wouldn't he ring the bell? Why just knock? And why did he seem so calm in the freezing cold? As he pondered, he heard it again. Ring, touch, touch. This time the knock seemed louder, more insistent. Emma felt her panic rising. She decided not to open the door. Something inside her screamed that it would be a mistake. Gathering her courage, she went back to the window to try and get a better look at the man's face. This time, he had raised his head slightly and seemed to be looking directly at the window where she was hiding behind the curtain. His eyes were dark and empty, almost expressionless, but there was something in them that made her stomach turn. He knew she was there. "I know you're there," he said suddenly, in a low, husky voice that cut through the silence of the night like a sharp blade. Emma instinctively stepped back and dropped her cell phone on the floor with a muffled sound. She covered her mouth with her hands to muffle any sound of heavy breathing. How did he know? She hadn't made any significant noise. The knocks continued, now faster and louder. Tock, tock, tock. With every knock on the door, Emma felt as if her heart was going to burst out of her mouth. She picked up her cell phone again and called the police with trembling hands. "Reykjavik police," answered a calm voice on the other end of the line. "There's someone at my door," Emma whispered desperately. "He's been knocking for minutes. He knows I'm here." "What's your address?" the attendant asked urgently. Emma provided the information while trying to keep her eyes fixed on the front door. The man was still there. She could hear his light footsteps moving across the porch now. He seemed to be pacing back and forth like a predator circling its prey. "A car is on its way," the attendant assured her before asking her to stay safely inside the house. But Emma knew something was wrong, very wrong. The man stopped knocking and started speaking again. "Emma, open the door." Her heart almost stopped when she heard her name come out of that unknown mouth. How did he know who she was? She had never seen that man before in her life. "I just want to talk," he said calmly, but there was something menacing in his too quiet tone. Minutes seemed like hours as Emma waited for the police to arrive. She heard his footsteps coming down the porch steps and thought for a moment that he might have left. But then she heard another sound, this time coming from the back of the house. Ringing, ringing, ringing. He was trying to get in through the back door now. Emma rushed to lock all the remaining doors and windows as tears streamed down her face. The man started banging on the windows too. Each blow seemed more desperate than the last. Finally, the red and blue lights of the sirens illuminated the street through the closed curtains of the living room. When the police arrived at the front door, Emma ran to open it, shaking from head to toe. But when they searched the area around the house, they found no one. The footprints in the snow clearly indicated where the man had been standing in the dim light of the porch and where he had walked to the back of the house. But they ended abruptly in the middle of the yard, covered in fresh snow. "It's impossible," said one of the confused policemen. "There are no marks indicating that he left." Emma has never been able to fully explain that night, not even to herself. But ever since, whenever she wakes up in the middle of the night to some strange sound coming from outside, she's never had the courage to peek out of the window again. 3. The invisible presence. It was the start of a busy semester at Edinburgh University in Scotland. Alex, a 22-year-old university student, had just moved into a small apartment near the campus. The place was old, with wooden floors that creaked with every step and windows that let in the biting cold of the Scottish nights. But for Alex, who was looking for privacy and tranquility to study, the apartment seemed perfect. For the first few weeks, everything went well. He dedicated himself to his classes, spent evenings revising subjects, and took advantage of the apartment's silence to concentrate. However, small things began to catch his attention. At first, they were details that were easy to overlook, a chair slightly out of place, or a cupboard door ajar that he was sure he had closed. I must be distracted, he thought to himself. After all, the long hours of study could be affecting his perception. But as the days went by, the incidents began to become more frequent and stranger. One night, on his way back from the library at around 11 p.m., Alex found all the lights in the apartment on. He was sure he had turned them off before leaving. Stranger still, he realized that the living room window was open, letting in the icy wind. He approached slowly and looked out, but saw no one in the silent street below. "Maybe I forgot," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the growing discomfort. The following days brought more inexplicable situations. One morning, Alex woke up to find his backpack open on the living room floor, with his notebooks scattered all over it. He was sure he had left it in the corner of his room the night before. Again, while studying in the kitchen, he heard a low sound coming from the bedroom, as if something had fallen. On investigating, he found his desk in a mess and one of the drawers open. His heart raced as he tried to find a logical explanation. "Maybe I left it like that without realizing it," he repeated to himself like a mantra. But the final straw came on a particularly quiet night. Alex was sitting on the sofa watching a series when he clearly heard the sound of the bathroom door closing by itself. He froze for a moment before plucking up the courage to check. The door was indeed closed, but he knew there was no one there but him. It was then that he decided to take action. The next day, Alex bought a set of simple security cameras and installed them at strategic points in the apartment. One in the living room, one in the hallway, and one in the bedroom. He wanted to prove to himself that it was all a figment of his imagination, or that there was a rational explanation. Perhaps air currents, or even small tremors that moved the objects. That night he went to bed feeling calmer. If anything happened again, the cameras would capture it all. The next morning, when he reviewed the recordings over coffee, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The images only showed the apartment empty throughout the night. Alex began to relax. Perhaps he really had been exaggerating. But that quickly changed. On the third night after installing the cameras, Alex woke up to a low sound coming from the living room, something like light footsteps on the wooden floor. He lay motionless in bed for a few minutes before plucking up the courage to check the recordings on the cell phone connected to the cameras. What he saw made his blood run cold. In the recording from the living room camera at around 3:15 a.m., he saw something that seemed impossible. The chair in front of the table moved back a few centimeters on its own, as if someone invisible had just sat there. There was no one visible in the image, just the subtle, deliberate movement of the chair. Alex paused the video several times, trying to find some error or logical explanation. Perhaps it was a technical problem, a fault with the cameras. But then came the scariest part. On the hallway camera, he saw the bathroom door slowly open at around 3:20, exactly as he had heard it the night before. And then something flashed past the camera lens, an indistinct, almost translucent shadow moving quickly towards his room. Alex felt panic take over as he watched the recording with trembling hands. He looked around the apartment as if he expected to see something there with him at that moment. That same morning, Alex decided to take the recordings to a close friend called Ethan, who studied technology and was skeptical about anything supernatural. Ethan analyzed the videos carefully and tried to find rational explanations: strong wind, moving the objects, or faults in the camera sensors. "I don't know what to say," Ethan finally admitted after hours of analyzing the files. "There's no manipulation here, but it doesn't make sense either." Alex began to avoid being alone in the apartment whenever he could. He spent more time in the library or at friends' houses and only came back late at night to get a quick sleep before classes the next day. But the presence seemed to know that. One evening, while going over his notes in the kitchen with headphones on to drown out the disturbing silence in the house, he felt something behind him, as if someone was standing there watching him. When he turned around quickly, nothing was there. Determined not to be intimidated by the unknown, Alex continued to live in the apartment until the end of the semester. However, he was never able to fully explain the events of that time. Even after moving elsewhere the following year, he still reviews the recordings from that camera occasionally, looking for answers he may never find. And whenever he watches that particular video where the shadow crosses the corridor into the bedroom, he feels as if he's still being watched by something invisible, something that may never have really gone away. If you're enjoying the stories so far, please subscribe to the channel. Not only does this help my work a lot, but it also guarantees that you won't miss out on any scary content like this. Shall we continue? 4. The Help House. At the beginning of 2025, Lucas, a budding true crime podcaster, decided to move to a small town in Ireland called Killarney. Known for its stunning scenery and rich history, the town seemed like the perfect place for him to focus on his next big project, investigating unsolved crimes. Lucas was obsessed with mysteries and always believed that the best way to understand a case was to immerse yourself completely in it. That's how he found the house. The property, a weathered Victorian building, was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall trees and an almost oppressive silence. It had been the scene of a brutal murder in the 1980s, a case that was never solved. The victim, a young woman called Margaret O'Sullivan, was found dead in the living room, but the circumstances of her death remained shrouded in mystery. Lucas saw the perfect opportunity. Living at the scene of the crime could provide unique insights for his podcast. Despite warnings from local residents about the house's strange energy, he didn't hesitate to rent it. For Lucas, this was just local folklore, the kind of thing that would make his podcast even more interesting. For the first few days, the house just seemed old and shabby. The floor creaked under his footsteps, and the wind made the windows rattle at night. Lucas spent hours going through Margaret's case files. Old newspaper clippings, police transcripts, and interviews with the few residents who still remembered the crime. But then, strange things started to happen. One morning, he found one of the internal doors open, something he was sure he had closed before going to bed. At first, he thought it was just the wind or his own distraction, but the incidents continued. Objects moved around, lights flickered for no apparent reason, and sometimes during the silent dawns, he would hear light footsteps coming from upstairs. Lucas decided to document all of this on his podcast. He described the occurrences as disturbing coincidences, but deep down he began to feel that there was something more going on in that house. One evening, while reviewing his audios in the living room, Lucas heard something strange on one of the recordings. A low, rhythmic sound that he didn't remember hearing live. He turned up the volume and realized that it was as if someone was knocking lightly on the wood, coming from the floor below him. Intrigued and a little frightened, he began to investigate. The room had an old central carpet that covered almost the entire floor. When he removed it, he found a small trap door that seemed to have been sealed for years. With effort, he managed to open it and discovered an empty space, a basement that wasn't on the house plan. Inside the basement was a dusty box containing personal belongings, an old diary, some faded photos, and a bracelet with the name Margaret engraved on it. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine. It was as if the house was showing something that wanted to be found. He spent hours reading the diary. The pages revealed intimate details of Margaret's life, her fears, her dreams, and even mentions of someone called E. The tone of the writing suggested that Margaret was being stalked or threatened by this person shortly before her death. As he investigated the case further on the basis of the new clues, events in the house began to intensify. Lucas would wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that he was being watched. Mirrors showed strange reflections, shadows where there should be nothing. and sometimes he would hear low whispers calling his name. One day, while recording an episode in the makeshift office upstairs, his camera fell off the tripod by itself. When he reviewed the images captured moments before the incident, he saw something terrifying, an indistinct shadow moving quickly behind him. Lucas tried to rationalize it all as the result of stress or his overactive imagination, but deep down, he knew he wasn't alone in that house. As the weeks went by, Lucas began to notice subtle changes in himself. He had memory lapses. He found notes in Margaret's diary that he didn't remember writing, and sometimes he woke up in different places in the house without knowing how he had got there. One particular incident marked the tipping point. During a live recording for his listeners, Lucas went into a trance in the middle of the broadcast. His voice changed. It became lower and slurred. While he said things that made no sense, she knew too much. She had to be silenced. When he returned to normal minutes later, he couldn't remember anything he had said. His listeners were shocked and started sending him messages asking if this was some kind of macabre staging to promote the podcast. Lucas then realized that something was deeply wrong, not just with the house, but with himself. Determined to understand what was going on before he completely lost control of himself, Lucas invited an expert in paranormal phenomena to investigate the house. The investigator brought equipment to detect supernatural activity and carried out a session in the room where Margaret was found dead. During the session, the sensors picked up unexplained energy fluctuations in the room. And then it happened. A female voice came through clearly on the digital recorder used by the investigator. She said just one sentence over and over again, and "You killed me." Lucas felt as if something inside him was trying to emerge, an intense anger mixed with fear. The investigator immediately stopped the session when he realized that Lucas was shaking violently and mumbling incomprehensible words. That same night, Lucas left the house, never to return. The podcast was never finished. Lucas disappeared from social media and never spoke publicly about his experience in the house. The few episodes released have become legendary among fans of true crime and paranormal phenomena. As for the house, it remains empty to this day. Locals say they sometimes see lights on in the windows or hear whispers coming from inside during the darkest nights. And so, the mystery of Margaret O'Sullivan's death remains unsolved, but those who dare to approach the house know that it still holds its secrets, waiting for the next person curious enough to enter. 5. The Man in the Window. It was a quiet night in a small country town in New Zealand. The full moon illuminated the deserted streets, and the distant sound of the wind blowing through the trees was the only music that filled the silence. Emily, a 19-year-old, had been hired to look after Sophie, a 6-year-old child, while her parents went out for a special dinner. It was a simple job. Put Sophie to bed at 8 p.m. and make sure the house remained safe until her parents returned. The house was large and secluded, surrounded by a vast garden and with few neighboring houses. Emily liked the calm and welcoming atmosphere of the house. After putting Sophie to sleep in the upstairs bedroom, she went downstairs to the living room, where she settled on the sofa with her favorite book. The clock struck 9:30 p.m. when something caught her eye. At a glance, she saw movement at the living room window. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, or perhaps the reflection of the trees swaying in the wind. But when she looked again, her heart almost stopped. There was a man standing outside, looking directly at her through the glass. The man was motionless, his face partially obscured by the darkness. He was wearing a thick coat and a hat that hid part of his features. His eyes, however, were unmistakable, cold and fixed on her. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine as she tried to process what she was seeing. She slowly got up from the sofa, trying not to show panic. She reached into her pocket for her cell phone and called Sophie's parents. "Hi, Emily, is everything all right?" her mother asked in a calm voice. "Yes, everything's fine," Emily lied as she kept her eyes fixed on the window. "I just wanted to know what time you'll be back." "We should arrive around midnight. Is Sophie all right?" "Yes, she's asleep," Emily answered quickly before hanging up. She didn't want to alarm her parents without knowing for sure what was going on. When she looked at the window again, the man was no longer there. Emily tried to convince herself that perhaps he was just a passerby or someone lost looking for help. But something inside her told her it wasn't that simple. She checked that all the doors and windows were locked. They were, and went back to the sofa trying to stay calm. But then she heard something, light footsteps in the back garden. She froze for a moment before getting up again and walking to the kitchen, which overlooked the back garden. Turning on the outside light, she saw the man standing there, this time closer to the glass door that led out into the garden. He didn't move when the light illuminated him. He just stood there, looking straight at her with that same cold, empty stare. Emily felt panic rise in her chest. She picked up her cell phone again and called the police. "Local police, what's the emergency?" answered a calm male voice. There's a man in my yard," she said in a hurried whisper. "He's watching me through the window." "Are you alone?" asked the attendant. "No, I'm looking after a child," Emily replied as she glanced nervously at the locked door. "Stay inside the house and keep all the doors locked. A police car is on its way." Emily hung up and tried to take deep breaths to calm down, but when she looked out into the yard again, he was gone. Determined to protect Sophie above all else, Emily quickly went upstairs to check that the girl was still asleep. To her relief, Sophie was peacefully in her bed, cuddled up with her favorite teddy bear. But then she heard something that made her blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of a window being opened downstairs. Emily knew she had locked all the windows before the night began. Her heart raced as she took Sophie in her arms and locked herself in the room with her. She searched desperately for something to use as a weapon and found a heavy lamp beside the bed. She heard slow footsteps coming up the stairs, deliberate footsteps, as if whoever it was knew exactly where she was. "I've already called the police," shouted Emily, hoping to scare off the intruder. But the footsteps continued. Suddenly, everything fell silent. Emily remained motionless for several minutes, holding Sophie tightly against her while hearing only her own panting. Then she heard a soft knock on the bedroom door. A ringtone. "Open the door," said a hoarse voice on the other side. Emily felt tears streaming down her face as she gripped the lampshade even tighter in her trembling hands. "Go away! The police are coming!" There was a moment of absolute silence before something heavy started banging against the door, hard enough to make it shake on the jambs. Before the door gave way completely, Emily heard sirens in the distance, a sound that had never seemed so comforting to her before. The knocks stopped abruptly, followed by the hurried sound of footsteps coming down the stairs and the back door being violently opened. When the police arrived at the house minutes later, they found Emily still locked in her room with Sophie in her arms. She told them everything that had happened while they searched the surroundings for the man. Although they found fresh footprints in the snow around the house, he had disappeared without a trace. In the days following the incident, Emily found it difficult to sleep or even go out alone at night. The police were never able to identify or locate the man from the window. He seemed to have evaporated into the cold night like a ghost. Sophie's parents installed cameras and reinforced the locks on the house afterwards. But this did little to alleviate Emily's persistent fear whenever she thought of that motionless figure in the dim light of the window, watching her as if he knew exactly who she was and how to get back into the house if he wanted to try again. 6. The call from the basement. It was the beginning of winter in a small town in the state of Vermont in the United States. Thomas, a 32-year-old university professor, had recently moved into an old house on the outskirts of town. The property was spacious and secluded, surrounded by dense forests and covered in a layer of fresh snow. He was looking for tranquility to work on his book about urban myths and legends, a project that consumed his nights and kept him up late. The house, built at the beginning of the 20th century, had a rustic charm, but also some peculiarities. Among them was the basement, a dark, damp space that Thomas rarely visited. He only used it to store boxes of old books and objects he didn't need at the moment. The basement, with its worn stone walls and musty smell, was the kind of place he preferred to avoid. For the first week after moving in, everything seemed normal. But then, on a particularly quiet night, Thomas heard something strange coming from the basement. It was a low, irregular sound, like a scratch or something being dragged across the floor. He stopped typing on the computer and tilted his head to listen better. It must just be the house settling down, he thought to himself, trying to ignore the shiver that ran up his spine. But the next night, the sound came again. This time it was clearer. Something was moving downstairs. Thomas went down to the basement entrance with a flashlight in his hand. The wooden door creaked open, revealing the narrow staircase that led to the dark space below. He turned on the dim ceiling light and descended slowly. The basement was as he had left it, boxes stacked against the walls and cobwebs in the corners. The sound had stopped again, as if it knew he was there. Thomas took a quick look around before climbing the stairs and locking the door behind him. "Probably rats," he said aloud to himself, trying to convince himself. But the following nights proved that it wasn't that simple. The sound continued every night at the same time, 3:13 in the morning. It was always the same pattern, scratches followed by something heavy being dragged. The insistence of the noise began to grate on Thomas's nerves. He could hardly sleep or concentrate on his work. Finally, after a week without adequate rest, he decided to investigate further. That night, armed with a more powerful flashlight and an iron bar in case he encountered any aggressive animals, he went down into the cellar again. This time he was determined to find the source of the sound. As he searched the space more carefully, he noticed something he hadn't noticed before. One part of the floor looked different. The boards there were slightly offset and had wear marks that didn't match the rest of the floor. Curious, Thomas knelt down and began to remove the loose boards. Under them, he found something unexpected, a small door made of rusty metal embedded in the floor. His heart raced as he tried to understand what he was seeing. The door had a heavy latch and looked like it hadn't been opened for decades. "What the hell is this?" he muttered to himself. Gathering his courage, he pulled hard on the latch until the door swung open with a loud metallic creak. Under the door was a narrow staircase made of stone that descended even deeper into the earth. A strong, unpleasant smell immediately rose up, something between mildew and rotten meat. Thomas hesitated for a moment before slowly descending the steps with his flashlight illuminating the way ahead. The staircase seemed endless, as if it were descending far beyond the foundation of the house. Finally, he reached a narrow corridor carved directly into the rock. The walls were covered in strange symbols carved into the stone, markings he had never seen before in his studies of mythology or ancient history. At the end of the corridor was another door, this one made of solid wood with rusty fittings. The sound coming from the basement was louder now, frantic scratching mixed with low, guttural moans. Thomas felt every fiber of his body begging him to turn back, but his curiosity was greater than his fear. He pushed the door open slowly and froze at what he saw. The space beyond the door was a circular chamber illuminated by torches whose flames flickered without apparent explanation. After all, there was no one there to light them. In the center of the room was a circle drawn on the floor with symbols similar to those on the walls of the corridor. And inside the circle, something was moving. It was a deformed humanoid figure, covered in pale, translucent skin that seemed overstretched over bones as thin as dry twigs. Its eyes were empty and black as abysses. Its hands ended in long claws that scratched the ground around it incessantly. When the creature sensed his presence, it slowly turned its head towards him, emitting a guttural sound that seemed to resonate directly in Thomas's mind. He instinctively backed away as he felt his body paralyze with absolute fear. The creature began to advance slowly towards him, but it seemed trapped inside the circle drawn on the ground. Thomas realized this quickly. That circle was some kind of barrier or protection against it, but it also seemed to be weakening as the creature's claws continued to scratch at its edges. Without a second thought, Thomas spun on his heels and ran up the stairs as fast as his legs would allow. When he reached the top, he locked both doors, the metal one on the floor and the one in the basement itself, before running out of the house without looking back. Thomas never returned to that house. He tried to alert the local authorities about what he found down there, but no one believed him or took his words seriously. The property remains abandoned to this day, but nearby residents say they hear strange sounds coming from it during the quietest nights. Persistent scratching followed by low moans, as if something was trying to get out. 7. The silent alarm. It was a cold, silent dawn in Portland, Oregon. The house of David, a young 28-year-old architect, was plunged into darkness. He had recently moved to the suburbs, looking for a quiet place to live away from the noise of the city. The house was modern, equipped with an advanced security system that he installed shortly after moving in. For David, a sense of security was essential, especially in such an isolated area. That night, David was sound asleep when he was abruptly awoken by the shrill sound of the house alarm. The electronic shriek shattered the early morning silence like a knife through the air. He leapt to his feet, his heart racing, and grabbed his cell phone from the bedside table to check the security system app. Nothing. No doors or windows had been opened, no movement detected by the external cameras. The system showed no activity. Confused and still groggy from sleep, David deactivated the alarm on his cell phone and sat on the bed for a few minutes, trying to catch his breath. It must be a system error, he muttered to himself, but something in the back of his mind told him it wasn't that simple. David slowly descended the stairs to the living room to check the doors and windows himself. Everything was locked as he had left it before going to sleep. The house was quiet again, except for the slight sound of the wind outside. Just as he was about to go back to his room, something caught his eye. One of the kitchen chairs seemed to be out of place. He had made sure that all the chairs were lined up at the table before he went to bed. Trying to ignore the growing discomfort, he pushed the chair back into place and went upstairs. Back in his room, David tried to sleep again, but sleep wouldn't come. He stared at the dark ceiling, listening to the small sounds of the house, the crackling of the walls settling into the cold, the low hum of the heater. But then he heard something that wasn't part of the house's routine, a faint sound, like footsteps dragging downstairs. He froze. For a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Maybe it was just the wind or some animal outside, but the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking through the room. Gathering his courage, David grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs again. The room was empty when he got downstairs, no sign of invasion or movement. He checked every corner of the house with the flashlight, illuminating the deep shadows that seemed to stretch even further in the dim light. It was then that he noticed something strange in the darkest corner of the room. Where the torchlight didn't seem to reach completely, there was a shadow that shouldn't have been there. It was darker than any other shadow around, almost solid, and seemed to have vaguely human outlines. David felt a shiver run down his spine as he stared at the still form in the corner. He blinked a few times, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination or a play of light. But then the shadow moved. It was subtle, a slight tilt of the head or what looked like a shoulder, but it was enough to set his heart racing. He instinctively took a step backwards and almost dropped the flashlight. "Who's there?" he asked in a shaky voice. No answer came, just absolute silence. David slowly retreated to the kitchen and grabbed a knife from the nearest drawer. When he returned to the living room with the flashlight trembling in his hand, the shadow had disappeared. Just as he started up the stairs again, trying to decide whether to call the police or simply leave the house that very night, the alarm went off again, even louder and more insistent than before. This time, however, something was different. The outside lights started flashing frantically while the system issued alerts on his cell phone, indicating motion detected. David quickly opened the app to check the external cameras. On his cell phone screen, he saw something that made his blood run cold. An indistinct figure moving quickly across the yard towards the back door. No details could be discerned. It looked more like a blurred silhouette than a real person, but it was there, and it seemed to be trying to get into the house. David ran to the back door and locked it again for safety, even though it had been locked before. He looked out of the window next to the door and saw only darkness outside, no figures visible now. But when he went back to his cell phone to review the recordings from the cameras, there was nothing registered, no movement captured by the lenses. David spent the rest of the night awake on the living room sofa with the knife by his side and all the lights on. When dawn finally broke, he decided to review all the recordings from the internal cameras as well. Perhaps there was something he had missed during the chaotic events of the night before. It was then that he found something terrifying on the camera installed in the room. At around 3:15 a.m., the same time the alarm first went off, a dark shadow appeared in the corner of the room, exactly where he had seen that strange shape the night before. But this time it was clearer. It looked humanoid, but distorted, as if it were being pulled or dragged by invisible forces inside that dark space. And then she looked directly into the camera. The eyes were two bottomless black holes. There was no discernible face beyond that. The figure remained motionless for a few seconds before disappearing completely into thin air, as if it had never been there. David left the house that same morning without looking back. He tried to sell the property months later, but always felt chills when he remembered that night, especially as he could never explain how that shadow seemed to have been inside the house from the start, waiting patiently for him to notice its presence. And to this day, when he thinks of that empty gaze captured by the camera, he feels as if he is still being watched by something hidden in the deepest shadows of the night's silence. And those were the 7 horror stories involving being alone at home. So, what did you think? Which one gave you the creeps? Tell us in the comments. If you liked the video, don't forget to like it. It really helps the channel grow and brings you more scary content. Until next time, and be careful when you're alone.